A 6-year-old girl walks barefoot through the icy streets when she spots a shop window filled with shining shoes. Without hesitation, she enters the luxury store and approaches a well-dressed man, unaware that he is the millionaire owner. With a trembling voice, she whispers, "Sir, may I shine all your shoes in exchange for a pair of used boots?" When he sees her bare, wounded feet, he asks why she has no shoes. The girl's answer brings him to tears. The biting December wind swept through the elegant streets of the downtown shopping district like an invisible blade, making the few pedestrians shrink deeper into their expensive coats. The gleaming storefronts reflected the Christmas lights, creating a fairy tale scene that contrasted cruelly with the cold reality of the icy sidewalks. Elena Morales pressed her small face against the glass of the most luxurious shoe boutique in the city, her brown eyes wide before the display of shoes that looked like precious jewels. Her small, bare feet trembled against the frozen concrete, leaving damp prints that dissolved quickly on the frost. The 6-year-old girl swallowed hard, feeling her empty stomach twist as she admired every detail of the displayed footwear. The shining leather of the men's dress shoes, the women's boots with their delicate heels, the colorful children's sneakers. It all seemed to belong to a world completely different from hers. Elena ran a small, grimy hand across the glass, as if she could touch that distant reality. Her fingernails were broken, her fingers chapped from the cold, but her determination remained unshakable. Behind her, the city pulsed with the late afternoon rush. Hurrying executives passed without a downward glance. Mothers dragged well-dressed children along the sidewalks. Street vendors shouted offers she had no money to accept. Elena had learned to become invisible in that world, but today, something different burned in her chest. The boutique's door opened with a soft jingle, and a tall, elegant man emerged, adjusting his Italian wool coat as he checked the gold watch on his wrist. Edward Sterling, 52, owner of one of the country's largest luxury footwear chains, had spent the last 20 years building an empire based on exclusivity and perfection. His graying hair was impeccably combed, his beard trimmed with millimeter precision, and his shoes, always his shoes, shone like mirrors. Edward lived his life like a carefully orchestrated symphony, where every note had its place and every silence its purpose. That's when he saw her, the small girl, dressed in a torn t-shirt and a skirt that had once been blue but was now an undefinable mix of faded shades. Her brown hair was matted, stuck together in places by dirt and dampness, but it was her feet that made Edward stop dead in his tracks. Small, wounded, with fresh cuts and others that had scarred badly. The soles were dark with grime and dried blood, and she balanced awkwardly, clearly in pain with every shift of weight. Yet, her eyes shone with an intensity that cut through all the defenses Edward had built over the years. Elena gathered all the courage she possessed and approached the elegant man. Her voice came out as a trembling whisper, but each word carried the weight of a determination that defied her age. "Mister, can I shine all your shoes in exchange for a pair of used boots?" Edward looked down, feeling something break inside his chest. The question had been asked with a humility that didn't beg for a favor, but offered labor. There was a dignity in this child that he rarely saw in adults. "Why don't you have any shoes?" The question came out harsher than he intended, but Elena wasn't intimidated. She lifted her chin as if preparing for a judgment and answered with devastating honesty, "I was hungry and I took a loaf of bread from the bakery. But the baker punished me by taking my shoes so that every time I walk, I remember never to take other people's food." The words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He felt tears burn his eyes, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. In that moment, looking at this brave, wounded child, something fundamental shifted in his perfectly ordered world. The wind continued to blow, the lights continued to shine, but for Edward Sterling, everything had changed forever. Edward remained motionless for long seconds, processing the words he had just heard. His analytical mind, accustomed to solving complex business problems, froze before the simple cruelty of the situation. A child had been punished for being hungry. The perverse logic of the punishment, using physical pain as a constant reminder, revealed a cruelty he had never imagined possible. "Come inside with me," he said finally, his voice softer than he intended. "But let's fix this now." Elena hesitated, her small fingers nervously toying with the hem of her torn shirt. "I don't want charity, mister. I want to work for the shoes. My mom always said you have to earn everything in life." Those simple words echoed in Edward's mind like a revelation. He had spent decades accumulating wealth, but how many times had he truly earned something through pure effort? The girl, even in her desperate situation, maintained a sense of dignity that many adults in his social standing had long lost. "All right," he replied, surprising himself with his own answer. "You can work, but first, let's take care of your feet." Inside the store, the contrast was even more shocking. The environment was a sanctuary of luxury, with polished marble floors, soft lighting, and shelves displaying footwear like works of art. Elena walked slowly, leaving small red marks on the immaculate floor. But Edward didn't care. Marianne, the store manager, a 40-year-old woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, watched the scene with a poorly concealed expression of disapproval. She had worked for Edward for 8 years and had never seen him act so impulsively. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, approaching discreetly. "Perhaps it's best to call Child Protective Services. This situation could create problems for the store." Edward faced her with a coldness she recognized as dangerous. "Marianne, prepare a basin of warm water, clean towels, and the first aid kit. Now." Elena had positioned herself before the children's shoe section, her eyes shining with a mix of desire and determination. She pointed to a pair of simple, brown boots, clearly used, a model that had been returned and was awaiting repair. "Those will do, mister. They don't have to be new." Edward felt a lump in his throat. The child was deliberately choosing the simplest pair, refusing to ask for more than she considered fair. He knelt beside her, matching her height. "What's your name?" "Elena. Elena Morales." "Elena, I'm Edward. And do you know how to shine shoes?" The girl's eyes lit up. "I do. I learned from watching old man Johnny in the square. He used to let me help sometimes before—" She stopped, biting her lower lip. "Before what?" "Before the security guards ran him off. They said he was an eyesore." Edward began to realize that Elena's story was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. Every detail she revealed painted a picture of a city that systematically marginalized its most vulnerable citizens. Marianne returned with the requested items, placing them on the floor with evident reluctance. Edward took a towel and began to gently clean Elena's wounded feet. The girl flinched initially but then relaxed, realizing he was being genuinely careful. "Does it hurt much?" he asked, noticing a particularly deep cut on her right heel. "Not more than the hunger," she replied with a simplicity that left him speechless. While Edward tended to her wounds, Elena looked around the store with respectful curiosity. "It must be hard to keep everything so beautiful and organized," she commented. "And why do you say that?" "Because beautiful things need a lot of care, and care is hard work." Edward stopped what he was doing and looked at her. In those simple words was a profound understanding of value and effort that he rarely heard from his most sophisticated clients. "Elena," he said, carefully placing the boots on her feet, "you start work tomorrow. But today, these shoes are an investment in our partnership." The girl smiled for the first time, and Edward realized his life had been irrevocably changed. The sun was still rising when Edward arrived at the store the next morning. His footsteps echoed in the empty shopping arcade, but he was not alone in his thoughts. The night had been restless, filled with images of injured feet and words about earning one's keep. For the first time in years, he had questioned the meaning of his perfectly structured routine. Eleanor was already there. She was sitting on the front step, the boots she'd been given the day before carefully tied, her hands busy with a piece of cloth that looked like it had been torn from some old garment. Seeing Edward approach, she stood up quickly, straightening her shoulders in a posture that tried to appear professional. "Good morning, Mr. Edward," she said, her voice still hoarse with sleep but resolute. "I brought my work supplies." Edward observed the supplies. Besides the cloth, Elena had a small, rusty can she had certainly found in the trash, and inside it, a dark mixture that smelled of homemade shoe polish. There was also an old toothbrush, likely her polishing tool. "Did you sleep here?" he asked, noticing that the girl's clothes were wrinkled and there was a small cardboard box propped against the wall next to the store. Elena lowered her eyes, as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. "I didn't want to be late on my first day, and it's safe here. Nobody bothers me when I'm near your store." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. While he had slept in his king-sized bed in a heated apartment, a 6-year-old child had spent the night in the cold to avoid being late for work. The irony of the situation struck him like a slap to the conscience. "Eleanor, you don't have to sleep on the street. There are places—" "No," she interrupted him with surprising firmness. "I've been to those places. It's better here." Edward decided not to press the issue at that moment, but a seed of concern began to grow in his mind. He unlocked the store, and Elena entered behind him, her eyes shining with the anticipation of someone about to fulfill an important promise. "Where do we start?" she asked, looking at the rows of displayed shoes. "First, let's set some rules," Edward said, surprised by his own patience. "You'll work inside here, where it's warm. We'll set up a proper station for you, with quality materials." Elena frowned. "But I have my own supplies. I know, and I can see you worked hard to get them. But in a store like this, we need to meet specific standards. That doesn't diminish your effort, it just makes it more efficient." The girl considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Like in school. The teacher used to say that having the right tools helps you do the job better. You went to school." "I did, until—" Eleanor stopped, biting her lip. "Until things got hard." Edward realized that every conversation with Elena revealed more layers of a story he didn't yet fully understand. He went to the stockroom and returned with a professional shoe care kit, brushes of different sizes, microfiber cloths, creams, and waxes of various colors. Elena's eyes widened at the quality of the materials. "Is all this for me? It's for the work you're going to do. And Elena, I'm going to teach you the proper technique. Shining shoes might seem simple, but there's an art to it." For the next hour, Edward found himself doing something he had never done before, teaching a child to care for footwear with the same passion he applied to his business. Elena absorbed every instruction with intense concentration, asking intelligent questions and demonstrating impressive motor skills for her age. "First, you clean off the dirt with this brush," he explained, demonstrating on a dress shoe. "Then you apply the cream in circular motions, always in the same direction. And finally, the final polish." Elena mimicked each movement with precision, her tongue peeking out from the corner of her mouth in concentration. The result was surprisingly good for a first attempt. "It's perfect," Edward said, and saw the girl's face light up with pride. "Can I do more?" "You can, but first, we're having breakfast." Eleanor hesitated. "Is that part of the job?" "It's part of treating the people who work with me well." In that moment, Edward realized he wasn't just teaching Elena how to shine shoes. He was learning something far more valuable about dignity, effort, and the true meaning of work. Elena's first week of work completely transformed the dynamic of the store. Her nimble little fingers could reach details that the adult employees often overlooked, and her dedication was so intense that she frequently forgot to take breaks. Edward watched, fascinated as she treated each shoe as if it were a work of art deserving her best effort. However, not everyone in the store saw the situation through the same eyes. Marianne had spent the entire week making subtle comments about dangerous precedents and the company's image. Her disapproving glances followed Elena down the aisles, and she made a point of obsessively cleaning any surface the girl touched. "Mr. Sterling," Marianne finally gathered the courage to address the issue directly. "I need to express my concerns about this situation." Edward was reviewing financial reports in his office at the back of the store, but the tension in Marianne's voice made him look up. "What situation, Marianne?" The other shop owners are talking. They say we're attracting the wrong kind of people to the shopping district." "The wrong kind of people?" Edward repeated the words slowly, his voice laced with a dangerous coldness. Marianne shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Sterling, it's nothing personal against the child, but we have a reputation to uphold. Our clients expect a certain standard." "And what standard is that, Marianne? The standard of ignoring a child who works harder than any of us." "This isn't about hard work," Marianne retorted, her frustration finally spilling over. "It's about propriety. She doesn't belong in this world. The customers are uncomfortable." Edward stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Uncomfortable with what?" "With the reminder that there are people less privileged than they are." Before Marianne could answer, Elena appeared at the office door, holding a shoe she had just polished. She had heard at least part of the conversation, and her eyes held a sadness far too mature for her age. "Mr. Edward," she said softly, "I don't want to cause trouble. I can work only when there are no customers." Elena's innocent suggestion was like a punch to Edward's gut. The girl was willing to hide herself, to become invisible, just so she wouldn't bother people who had never spent a single day in her shoes. "You will not hide," he said firmly. "You work here like any other employee." Marianne let out an exasperated sigh. "Mr. Sterling, be reasonable. Yesterday, Mrs. Davenport saw the girl and made a comment about declining standards. She's one of our best customers." "Then Mrs. Davenport can take her standards elsewhere," Edward replied, his patience finally snapping. Elena watched the exchange with wide eyes. In her short life, she had learned that adults rarely defended children like her. Seeing Edward stand up for her awakened an emotion she could barely comprehend, the feeling of being valued. "You know what else, Marianne?" Edward continued, his voice gaining an intensity that made the manager flinch. "Elena has been working here for 1 week and has already improved the quality of our services. She treats every shoe as if it's precious, something I haven't seen from some of our staff in years." Marianne opened her mouth to protest, but Edward silenced her with a wave of his hand. "Furthermore, since Elena started working here, 3 customers have made a point of praising the exceptional polish on their shoes." "3, Marianne? When was the last time we received spontaneous compliments on our services?" It was true. Elena had developed her own technique that combined extreme care with a natural intuition for what each type of leather needed. Her results were consistently superior to those of the most experienced employees. "But Mr. Sterling," Marianne tried one last time, "what if someone calls the authorities? What if they question the legality of a child working here?" Edward hesitated. It was a legitimate concern, and he knew he was navigating tricky legal waters. But looking at Eleanor, who held the polished shoe like a trophy of her self-worth, he realized that some things were more important than bureaucracy. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," he said finally, "but I will not abandon Elena for fear of hypothetical problems." Elena approached Edward and whispered, "Thank you for believing in me, mister." In that moment, Edward realized he wasn't just facing Marianne's resistance, he was confronting an entire system that preferred to keep inequalities invisible rather than deal with them head-on. The weekend brought an unusual quiet to the store, but Edward couldn't relax. There was something about Elena's story that didn't quite add up. Details she mentioned in passing that revealed a more complex reality than he had initially imagined. On Saturday morning, he decided to investigate further. Elena had casually mentioned the name of the baker who had punished her, Al Miller, owner of the Golden Crust Bakery, just 3 blocks from the boutique. Edward knew the place by sight, a traditional bakery that mainly served the neighborhood's middle class. The thought of confronting the man made him nervous, but he needed to understand what had really happened. The bakery was bustling when Edward arrived. The smell of fresh bread and coffee contrasted with the tension he felt in his chest. Al Miller was a stocky man in his 40s, with a graying mustache and thick hands from years of working with dough. He served customers efficiently, but Edward noticed a hardness in his eyes that made him uneasy. Edward waited for the line to thin before approaching. "Mr. Miller, I'd like to talk to you about a girl named Eleanor." Al's expression immediately hardened. "What girl?" "A 6-year-old girl, brown hair, whom you punished for taking a loaf of bread from your bakery." "Oh, that little thief," Al said with contempt. "So what? She stole, she got punished. That's how these kids learn." Edward felt his blood boil but forced himself to stay calm. Punished by taking her shoes, a 6-year-old child? "These street kids need to learn early on. They can't just take what they want," Al retorted, wiping his hands on his apron. "If I do nothing, tomorrow they'll come back with their friends to steal more." "She was hungry," Edward said, his voice growing lower and more dangerous. "And that's my fault. I'm not her father. Everyone's got their own problems to deal with." Edward was about to reply when another customer approached. An elegant man in an expensive suit that Edward recognized from the boutique next to his. "Al," the man said, "how's our little educational program going?" Al smiled conspiratorially. "Working perfectly, Mr. King. Since we started getting tougher with these kids, the problems have decreased drastically." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the way the two men spoke that suggested a deliberate coordination, as if Elena's punishment hadn't been an isolated incident. "Pardon the interruption," Edward said, feigning casualness. "But what do you mean by an educational program?" Mr. King studied him with calculating eyes. "And you are?" "Edward Sterling, from Sterling and Sons Fine Footwear." "Ah, yes," Mr. King's smile widened. "I heard you've been hiring some unusual staff." The way he said unusual staff made it clear that news about Elena had spread among the local business owners faster than Edward had imagined. "Okay, if you're referring to the fact that I gave a talented child an opportunity for dignified work, then yes," Edward replied. Al and Mr. King exchanged a look that Edward couldn't fully interpret, but that left him deeply unsettled. "Mr. Sterling," Mr. King said carefully, "these street kids are more dangerous than they seem. They operate in groups. They follow patterns. What might seem like a good deed on your part could actually be putting your business at risk." "What kind of risk?" "Theft, property damage, driving away respectable clientele," Al enumerated. "That's why we've developed methods to discourage them." Edward understood with growing horror that Elena hadn't been the victim of a random punishment, but part of a systematic campaign to drive homeless children from the shopping district. The cruelty of what they did to her wasn't impulsive, it was calculated. "And do the authorities know about this?" Edward asked. "The authorities understand the need to maintain order," Mr. King answered vaguely. "Some sacrifices are necessary for the greater good." Edward left the bakery with more questions than answers, but one absolute certainty. Elena was at the center of something much larger and more sinister than he had imagined. And now, by publicly defending her, he had made himself a target. Walking back to the store, Edward noticed he was being followed by a man in a dark suit who was pretending to window shop. The feeling that he had awakened dangerous forces made him quicken his pace, thinking of Elena sleeping unprotected in her cardboard box. Monday arrived with a light rain that turned the streets into a grey, melancholy mirror. Edward got to the store earlier than usual, anxious to tell Elena about his discoveries and discuss how they could protect themselves. He had spent all of Sunday planning a careful conversation, thinking about how to explain to a 6-year-old that she was at the center of something dangerous without terrifying her. But Elena wasn't in her usual spot. The cardboard box where she slept was there, soaked by the rain, but empty. Edward felt a cold pit in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. He searched the surrounding area, checked every alley and doorway within a 3-block radius, but found no sign of her. "Marianne," he said when the manager arrived, "did Elena show up today?" "No, Mr. Sterling. I thought it was her day off." "She doesn't have days off. Something is wrong." Edward spent the entire day in a state of mounting anxiety. Every time the door's bell chimed, he looked up hopefully, only to be disappointed. In the afternoon, he decided to actively search for her, visiting places she had casually mentioned during their conversations. The square where Old Man Johnny used to shine shoes was his first stop. Edward found some homeless people who knew Elena, but no one had seen her since Friday. An elderly man named Benny, who seemed to be respected among the local homeless community, pulled Edward aside. "You're the shoe store owner, right? The little girl talked a lot about you." "Talked? Why are you using the past tense?" Benny glanced around nervously before answering. "Because since Saturday, strange people have been asking about her. Men in suits, saying they're social workers. But real social workers don't drive around in expensive cars." Edward's heart hammered. What kind of questions were they asking? They wanted to know where she slept, who she talked to, if anyone was influencing her. "Elena got scared and ran off when they showed up here yesterday, and you don't know where she went." "Smart kid, that one. Knows hiding spots even we don't. But mister, those people were no good. They had the look of hunters, not helpers." Edward thanked Benny and continued his search, now with an even greater sense of urgency. He visited shelters, talked to other business owners, and even went to the police precinct to report Elena missing. But the officer on duty was dismissive. "Street kids go missing all the time," the officer said without even looking up from his paperwork. "They usually turn up in a few days, but this one is different. She has a routine, responsibilities. Something happened. Sir, with all due respect, these kids don't have responsibilities. They roam. It's their nature." Edward left the precinct frustrated and furious. The officer's attitude confirmed his suspicions that there was a network of indifference, if not active complicity, that allowed children like Eleanor to be treated as disposable. On Tuesday, Eleanor still hadn't appeared. Edward could barely work, constantly checking the door and the phone. Marianne tried to convince him that maybe it was for the best, that the girl had moved on, but he silenced her with an icy glare. It was on Wednesday that Edward received the first real lead. An elegant woman entered the store, someone he had never seen before, but who clearly knew the establishment's reputation. "Mr. Sterling, I'm Dr. Evelyn Reed, a social worker with the city. I believe we have a situation to discuss." Edward invited her into his office, a dark premonition growing in his chest. "It's about the girl you were employing," she said, pulling a file from her briefcase. "See Elena Morales, correct?" "Where is she?" Edward asked directly. "She's safe," Dr. Reed answered evasively. "We received reports that a child was being exploited in child labor. We were obligated to intervene." "Child labor? She was learning a trade, being cared for." "Mr. Sterling, I understand your good intentions, but the law is clear. Children cannot work, especially in irregular situations like this." Edward studied the woman's face, searching for signs of sincerity or deceit. There was something in her eyes that didn't match the professional concern she was feigning. "Can I visit her?" "That wouldn't be appropriate at this time. Elena is undergoing a period of adjustment in a suitable institution." "What institution?" "That's confidential." Edward realized he was being deliberately stonewalled. and the feeling that Elena was in real danger grew until it was almost unbearable. Edward couldn't sleep that night. Every attempt to close his eyes was interrupted by images of a frightened Elena, hiding from men in suits who claimed to be helping. At 3 in the morning, he gave up trying to rest and decided to take an action he knew was risky, but necessary. Using his business contacts and a considerable sum of money, Edward hired a private investigator, Robert Shaw, a former cop with a reputation for being discreet and efficient. Shaw had connections that could access information Edward could never obtain on his own. "I need you to find a girl named Elena Morales," Edward said during a clandestine meeting in a cafe far from the shopping district. "She was supposedly taken by social workers, but I suspect something else is going on." Shaw listened intently as Edward recounted everything, from his first meeting with Eleanor to the suspicious conversations at the bakery and the girl's sudden disappearance. "This Dr. Evelyn Reed," Shaw said, taking notes. "Are you sure she was legitimate?" "I'm not sure of anything anymore," Edward admitted, "but there was something about her demeanor that was off. She knew too much about my situation with Elena, as if she was being briefed by someone." Shaw worked quickly. In 2 days, he returned with information that left Edward stunned and furious. "Dr. Evelyn Reed exists," Shaw began. "But she's been on medical leave for 3 months. The woman who visited your store was an imposter." Edward felt his blood run cold. "Then who was that woman?" "Digging deeper, I uncovered a disturbing network. That Mr. King you mentioned, he's not just some businessman. He owns several private security firms and has contracts with the city for urban renewal." Urban renewal, eh? Removing homeless people, especially children, from valuable commercial areas. Officially, they claim to be doing social work. In practice, Shaw paused, his expression turning grim. "Edward, they have a well-organized scheme." Shaw opened a folder with photographs and documents. "They identify homeless children who might cause problems, either by begging in upscale areas or by forming bonds with influential people like you. Then, using forged documents, they remove these children, claiming it's for their own good. And where do they take them? To a rural institution about 100 miles from here. Officially, it's an orphanage. Unofficially," Shaw hesitated, "the children are used as cheap labor on local farms, forced labor disguised as vocational training." Edward felt nausea rise in his throat. "Is Elena there?" "I believe so. But Edward, there's something else you need to know." Shaw pulled another document from the folder. "Elena is not an orphan. Her mother, Isabel Morales, is alive." Edward stared at the paper in disbelief. "But Elena said..." "Elena believes her mother is dead because that's what they told her. Isabel Morales was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility 6 months ago, right after she tried to report the child exploitation ring to the authorities." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in Edward's mind with terrifying clarity. They separated mother and daughter to silence her. Exactly. Isabel saw other children being taken and tried to alert the press. In retaliation, they used their connections to have her declared mentally incompetent and committed. Elena was left on the streets deliberately so that she would eventually be rescued by the same system that destroyed her family. Edward stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "We have to get them out of there, now." "Edward, wait. This is more complicated than it looks. These people have legal protection, official documentation. If we act rashly, we could make the situation worse for Elena and her mother. So what do you suggest?" Shaw studied him carefully. "I need to know, how far are you willing to go to save this girl? Because what I'm about to propose could destroy life as you know it." Edward thought of Elena, her determined eyes, her refusal of charity, her dedication to her work, her courage in the face of adversity. He thought of a 6-year-old sleeping in a cardboard box because she had no one else in the world. He thought of a mother locked away in an institution for trying to protect other people's children. All the way, he said without hesitation, no matter the cost. Shaw smiled for the first time since they'd met. Then we're going to need a very careful plan, and we're going to need to act fast. Because the longer Elena spends in that place, the harder it will be to get her back. Edward realized his life had reached an irreversible turning point. In a few short weeks, he had gone from a prosperous businessman concerned only with profits to someone willing to risk everything for a child he barely knew, but who had touched something fundamental in his soul. The war had been declared. The next 3 days transformed Edward into someone he barely recognized. The meticulously controlled businessman had given way to a man obsessed with a single mission: to rescue Elena and her mother. He temporarily closed the store, claiming renovations, and dedicated all his time to planning with Shaw. The plan they developed was risky and complex. Shaw had managed to get an inside contact at St. Jude's Psychiatric Center, where Isabel was being held, and the information they received was devastating. Isabel was being kept under heavy sedation, officially for episodes of agitation, but in practice to prevent her from speaking to any outside visitors or authorities. The worst part, Shaw explained during a meeting in an abandoned warehouse they'd chosen as an operations base, is that she doesn't know where Elena is. They told her the girl was adopted by a family overseas. Edward clenched his fists. How can they be so cruel? Because cruelty works. It keeps people silent through despair. Shaw had also gathered intelligence on the rural institution where Eleanor was being held. The place was presented as a model orphanage, but operated like a farm where children worked from dawn till dusk, supposedly learning the value of hard work. Elena is in the adjustment wing, Shaw continued, consulting his notes. It's where they put kids who resist or ask too many questions. The regimen is particularly harsh: isolation, food restriction, extra labor. Edward felt tears burn his eyes. The image of Eleanor, who had always maintained her dignity even in the worst circumstances, being systematically broken by these monsters, was unbearable. How much time do we have before she's moved to the general program? A week? Maybe 2. After that, it'll be much harder to get her out of there without raising suspicion. Edward stood up and began to pace. Then let's move. What's the plan? Shaw unfolded a detailed map of the region where the institution was located. The operation has to be coordinated. First, we get Isabel out of the clinic. Without her lucid and free to confirm the truth about Elena, any attempt to rescue the girl will be seen as kidnapping. How do we get Isabel out? My contact at the clinic is a nurse named Julia. She's willing to help because she's seen too many suspicious cases like Isabel's. She can gradually reduce Isabel's medication and create an opportunity for her to slip out during a supervised therapeutic walk. Edward nodded. And Elena? That's trickier. The farm is isolated, well guarded. But I found out they take a monthly educational visit to the nearest town. The children are paraded around to show local officials how well cared for they are. Shaw pointed to a date on the calendar. The next visit is in 5 days. During the trip, there's a point where the road passes through an isolated forest area. It's our best shot. You're talking about intercepting an official vehicle. I'm talking about saving an innocent child who's being held against her will in a forced labor situation. We can argue about the legality later. Edward weighed the implications. If he were caught, he would lose everything: his company, his reputation, possibly his freedom. But if he didn't act, Elena would continue to suffer, and Isabel would remain locked away as a madwoman. But there's another complication, Shaw continued. Mr. King and his associates are watching you. They know you're digging. Yesterday, 2 men were at your store asking for you. Did Marianne talk to them? Yes. She told them you were away on business, but they didn't seem convinced. Edward realized that time was running out fast. The longer they delayed, the more dangerous the situation would become for everyone involved. Robert, I want you to know that if something goes wrong, you need to walk away. I won't let your life be ruined because of my decision. Shaw smiled wryly. Edward, I'm in this up to my neck. I've found out things about this network that keep me up at night. Even if you backed out now, I'd keep going. Then we're in this together. To the end. Edward looked at the map, memorizing every detail of the operation that would forever change the destinies of 3 people. In 5 days, he would either be a hero or a fugitive. But looking at a photo of Elena that Shaw had managed to obtain, the girl in an institution uniform, her eyes losing the spark, Edward knew. He knew there was no real choice. The operation would begin tomorrow with Isabel's liberation. Elena's rescue would come next. And then, if all went well, they would have to disappear long enough to expose the whole truth to the world. St. Jude's Psychiatric Center stood like a white fortress against the grey Thursday morning sky. Edward watched the building from a distance, parked on a side street, his heart pounding so hard he feared it could be heard. For the past 72 hours, Julia had been gradually reducing Isabel's medication, allowing her to regain lucidity for increasingly longer periods. Robert was positioned in a rented van on the other side of the clinic. Monitoring security cameras through equipment Edward preferred not to ask about. The plan was simple in theory, terrifying in practice. During the 2:30 p.m. therapeutic walk, Julia would create a distraction, allowing Isabel to escape through the back of the clinic's garden. "Edward, I've got movement," Robert's voice crackled over the radio. "And Julia is heading out with 3 patients to the garden." Edward adjusted his rearview mirror and saw a small group walking slowly along the wooded paths at the rear of the clinic. Even from a distance, he recognized Isabel, a thin woman in her early 30s, with disheveled brown hair, moving with the slowness of someone still recovering from prolonged sedation. "How is she?" Edward asked, his voice tense. "Walking on her own, that's a good sign." "Julia said she's lucid but still fragile. The meds have left some side effects." Edward felt a wave of rage against the people who had deliberately destroyed a desperate mother's mind. Isabel had committed the crime of trying to protect children, and for that, she was punished with months of psychological torture disguised as medical treatment. "Stand by," Robert said. "Julia is approaching the rendezvous point." The point was a small gate at the back of the garden, normally locked, but which Julia had left ajar earlier. The plan depended on Julia distracting the other patients long enough for Isabel to slip away unseen. Edward saw Julia, a young woman in a white uniform, point to something in the opposite direction of the gate, drawing the attention of the 2 other patients. This was the moment. Isabel, moving with a determination that surprised Edward, walked quickly toward the gate. For a terrifying second, Edward thought she'd gotten confused and was heading the wrong way. But then he realized Isabel was pretending to examine the flowers near the exit, waiting for the perfect moment. "Now," Robert whispered into the radio. Isabel opened the gate and slipped out. Edward started the car and drove to the pickup point, a corner 2 blocks from the clinic. When Isabel appeared, walking quickly but trying not to draw attention, Edward was shocked by her appearance. The woman who got into his car was visibly frail. Her eyes, though alert, showed the mark of forced medication, a slowness in focus that made every movement deliberate. Her hands trembled slightly, and she seemed to be making a conscious effort to speak clearly. "Are you the man who is helping my Elena?" were her first words, her voice hoarse but determined. "I am. I'm Edward, and we're going to find Elena, I promise." Isabel closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "But they told me she'd been adopted, that she was in another country. But I knew. A mother always knows when they're lying about her child." Edward drove carefully, following the escape route they had planned. "Isabel, I need you to tell me everything you remember about what you saw before you were committed. Every detail could help save Elena." Isabel fought through the fog that still partially clouded her mind. It was always the same kinds of kids who disappeared. Boys and girls between 5 and 10. First, they'd be punished by the shopkeepers for little things, taking food, sleeping in inappropriate places. Then the social workers would show up to take them away. "You reported this?" I tried. I went to 3 different police precincts, 2 social services offices, even a local newspaper. But they always told me I was imagining things, that I was too stressed by Eleanor's situation. Edward realized Isabel had faced the same wall of indifference and denial he had encountered when he tried to report Eleanor's disappearance. "It was after I went to the newspaper that they came for me," Isabel continued, her voice growing stronger as the memories became clearer. "2 men in suits said I needed psychological help to deal with the stress. Before I could react, they gave me a shot, and Elena, I hid her with a neighbor when I realized they were following me, but when I woke up in the clinic weeks later, they told me Elena had run away and was never seen again." Isabel began to cry. 6 months, Edward. 6 months without knowing if my daughter was alive. Edward pulled into an isolated gas station where Robert was waiting for them. When Isabel saw the investigator, she flinched instinctively. "He's a friend," Edward reassured her. "He's the one who found out where Elena is." Robert approached carefully, recognizing the signs of trauma Isabel displayed. "Mrs. Morales, I know it's hard to trust strangers right now, but I need you to know your daughter is alive, and we're going to get her tomorrow." Isabel looked from Edward to Robert, and then something in her expression shifted. The vulnerability gave way to a fierce determination that Edward recognized immediately. It was the same determination he had seen in Elena's eyes. "What do I need to do?" Robert smiled. "We need you to hide until we have Elena. Afterwards, the 2 of you will give the testimony that will bring this whole network down. And if something goes wrong with the rescue," Edward took Isabel's trembling hand, "it won't go wrong. I promise you will hug your daughter tomorrow night." It was a dangerous promise to make, but looking at this mother who had lost 6 months of her life for trying to protect children, Edward knew he would do anything to keep it. Friday's dawn brought a thick fog that blanketed the country road like a grey shroud. Edward had been up all night, mentally reviewing every detail of the rescue plan. Isabel had slept fitfully in the back seat of the car, murmuring Elena's name between nightmares. Robert was positioned 2 miles ahead, monitoring the road with binoculars. At 9:15 a.m., the radio crackled. "Vehicle in sight. White van, official plates, exactly as predicted." Edward felt the adrenaline surge through his veins. Isabel woke instantly, as if her maternal instinct had detected Elena's proximity. "Is it time?" she asked, her voice still hoarse but resolute. "It's time." The plan was risky but necessary. Robert had discovered that during these educational visits, the children were transported in a van with only 2 supervisors. The road went through a sharp curve surrounded by dense woods, the perfect spot for an interception that looked like an accident. Edward drove to the designated point and parked the car sideways across the lane, turned on the hazard lights, and popped the hood, faking a breakdown. Isabel hid behind a nearby tree as planned. She needed to see Elena first, to confirm it was really her daughter, before they acted. "Vehicle approaching," Robert warned over the radio. "Slowing down for the obstruction." Edward saw the white van appear around the bend. Through the windshield, he could make out 2 figures in the front seat, a man driving and a woman in a uniform beside him. But it was the small silhouettes in the back that made his heart race. The van stopped. The driver, a heavy-set, middle-aged man, got out with an irritated expression. "What's the problem here? This road needs to be clear." Edward pretended to examine the engine. "Sorry, sir. The car just died on me. I've already called a tow truck, but it's going to be a while." While talking to the driver, Edward tried to peer through the van's tinted windows. That's when he heard a small, familiar voice. "Mr. Edward." His blood ran cold. Elena had recognized him through the window. The woman in the uniform, whom Edward now saw, was a stern supervisor with a face that tolerated no nonsense, got out of the van immediately. "How does this child know you?" she demanded, her voice thick with suspicion. Edward improvised quickly. "I think she's mistaken me for someone else. Kids do that sometimes." But Elena was pressing her face against the window, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and confusion. Edward could see she was thinner, her hair cut in an institutional style, but it was unmistakably the same brave girl he had met. "Elena, sit down," the supervisor ordered harshly. "Do not talk to strangers." It was at that moment that Isabel emerged from behind the tree. She had planned to wait for the signal, but seeing her daughter just a few feet away shattered all her resolve. "Elena, my baby girl." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Elena screamed, "Mommy," with a force that echoed through the forest. She began pounding on the window, trying to open the van's locked door. The supervisor immediately understood that some kind of ambush was underway. "Carlos, call for backup, now!" The driver scrambled for the van's radio, but Robert emerged from the woods at that moment, blocking his path. "No one's calling anyone," Robert said calmly, but his posture made it clear he wasn't joking. Edward realized the moment of truth had arrived. There was no more pretending this was a random accident. "That child was illegally separated from her mother," Edward said, his voice gaining authority. "Isabel Morales was forcibly committed to stop her from exposing a child exploitation ring. Elena is not an orphan, and she does not belong in any institution." "This is kidnapping," the supervisor shrieked. "And you're committing a federal crime." "The crime was committed against these two," Robert replied. "We're just correcting an injustice." Inside the van, Eleanor was having an emotional breakdown. Months of repressed grief and confusion exploded in a torrent of tears and cries for her mother. The other children in the van, Edward could now see there were about 6 of them, were frightened and crying too. Isabel approached the van, placing her hands on the glass where Elena pressed hers from the inside. "Mommy's here, my love. Mommy's here." The supervisor was clearly panicking. "You don't understand the implications of what you're doing. These children are under the legal protection of the state." "Protection?" Edward exploded. "Elena told me about the regimen at that farm. Forced labor from dawn, punishments for asking questions, isolation to break their spirit. That isn't protection. It's systematic abuse." Robert had managed to get the van keys from the driver. He opened the back door, and Eleanor flew into Isabel's arms. The reunion between mother and daughter was so intense that even the supervisor stopped protesting for a moment. Elena clung to Isabel as if she feared she might disappear again, whispering, "Mommy, mommy, mommy," like a prayer. "Never again," Isabel sobbed, holding Elena tight. "They will never separate us again." Edward watched the scene with tears in his eyes, knowing they had crossed a line from which there was no return. They were now officially fugitives, but looking at Elena safe in her mother's arms, he knew it had been the right decision. The problem now was keeping them safe long enough to expose the whole truth. The reunion between Eleanor and Isabel lasted only a few precious minutes before the reality of the situation forced them to act. Robert had bound and gagged the supervisor and the driver, a decision that officially turned their rescue operation into a kidnapping, at least in the eyes of the law. "Edward, we need to get out of here now," Robert said, constantly checking the road. "They're on a tight schedule. When they don't arrive at their destination on time, they'll send backup." Elena was clinging to Isabel, as if she feared she might disappear again, but her eyes constantly sought out Edward. "Damn, Mr. Edward, you came for me," she said, her voice small but full of relief. "I promised I'd look after you," Edward replied, kneeling beside her. "And promises have to be kept." Isabel looked at Edward with a gratitude that went beyond words. How can I thank you for risking everything for us? By taking care of Elena and helping to make sure this never happens to other children, Edward answered. Robert interrupted the moment. Folks, talk later. We need to move now. They transferred Elena and Isabel to Edward's car, while Robert took the official van to throw off any initial tracking. The plan was to meet at a safe house Robert had prepared, an isolated cabin about 30 miles away. During the drive, Elena told Edward and Isabel about her months at the farm. Her voice was controlled, but Edward could sense the trauma behind the carefully chosen words. They told me you were dead, Mommy, Elena whispered, burying her face in Isabel's shoulder. They said I was an orphan and I should be grateful to have a place to stay. And the work? Edward asked gently. We got up at 5 in the morning. We worked in the fields until it got dark. Anyone who complained didn't get dinner. Anyone who asked questions about their families went to the quiet room. Isabel held Elena tighter. What was the quiet room? A dark, cold place where you were left alone for days. They only gave you water and stale bread. Edward felt rage burn in his veins. What these people had done to Eleanor, to all those children, was more than exploitation. It was systematic, psychological torture. They arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. Robert was already there, but his expression was grim. We have a problem, he said as soon as they entered. What kind of problem? The van had GPS. They tracked our route until I could disable it. But that only bought us 2 hours at most. And the other children from the van, I left them at a police station with a note explaining the situation. I hope someone has enough sense to investigate before sending them back to that farm. Edward realized they had underestimated the corrupt network's response time, so they know our approximate location. They do, and there's more. I managed to intercept some communications. Mr. King has mobilized people in official positions. They're issuing arrest warrants for us for kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and interfering with a legal child protection process. Isabel paled. Can they find us here? Eventually. Yes, this cabin only buys us a few more hours of safety. Elena, who had remained silent during the conversation, finally spoke. There's a place we can hide. Everyone turned to her. What place, my love? Isabel asked. The place where I lived before I met Mr. Edward. It's an abandoned building that nobody knows about. Not even the men who chased me could ever find me there. Edward hesitated. The idea of returning to the city, close to their enemies, seemed insane. But looking at Elena, he realized she knew every alley, every hiding spot, every escape route in that urban area. It's risky, Robert said, but it might just work temporarily. They'll expect us to run far away, not double back into their territory. And how much time would that give us? Edward asked. Enough to execute the final part of the plan, Robert answered. I have contacts in the national media who are willing to hear our story, but I need solid evidence and recorded testimonies. Isabel straightened up. I can testify about everything I saw before they committed me, and about what they did to me in the clinic. And I can talk about the farm, Elena added with a courage that stunned Edward. No, Edward said firmly. Elena is not going to expose herself to that. She's been through enough trauma. Elena looked at him with that familiar determination shining in her eyes. Mr. Edward, if I don't tell them what happened, other children will go through what I went through. Edward realized that Elena had matured in a terrible way during the months of separation. The girl he had known, determined but still innocent, had become someone who understood the weight of responsibility and the importance of justice. It's decided then, Robert said. We go back to the city tonight. Tomorrow, we tell our story to the world. As they prepared to leave, Edward looked at Elena and Isabel in an embrace and realized that, no matter what happened from that moment on, they had already won the most important battle. They had proven that love and determination could overcome even the most corrupt systems. Now they just had to survive long enough to make that victory permanent. The abandoned building Elena knew was in the heart of the city, ironically just 6 blocks from Edward's boutique. It was a commercial building that had gone bankrupt years earlier, but Elena had discovered a secret entrance through the sub-basement that kept her invisible even when the authorities were looking for her. "This way," Elena whispered, guiding them through a hole in the grate protecting a basement window. No one would ever think to look here. The hideout Elena had created on the 3rd floor was astonishing. She had gathered discarded mattresses, blankets found in the trash, and even a few books someone had thrown away. It was the home of a child who had learned to survive on her own, and Edward's heart broke to imagine Elena spending lonely nights in this place. "Is this where you stayed when you weren't at the store?" Edward asked. "Sometimes, when it was too cold or when strange men were looking for me on the street." Isabel hugged Elena tighter, understanding for the first time the extent of the loneliness her daughter had faced. Robert was setting up recording equipment he had brought in a backpack. "We need to do this fast," he said. "The longer we stay put, the greater the chance of being discovered." Through the grimy window, Edward could see the city lights twinkling in the night. Down below, life went on as usual, people coming home from work, families eating dinner together, children sleeping safely in their beds. The normality of that world seemed almost surreal after everything they had been through. "Edward," Robert said, testing the camera, "I got a message from my contact at the paper. The investigative journalist, Anna Carlson, is on her way. She's known for exposing corruption rings. If we can convince her, our story will be on the front page tomorrow." Edward nodded, but a worry was growing in his mind. "Now what if she doesn't believe us? What if they think we made it all up?" "That's why we need the recordings," Isabel said, her voice firmer than Edward had heard since they rescued her. "I have names, dates, specific details about how the scheme worked. Elena has evidence of what happened at the farm. And I have documents proving the financial connections," Robert added. "During my investigation, I discovered the farm was receiving government subsidies to care for needy orphans while profiting from selling what the children produced." It was then that they heard footsteps in the hallway. Everyone froze. Elena immediately positioned herself near an escape route she had planned, demonstrating survival instincts a 6-year-old should never have had to develop. "Relax," a woman's voice said from the hall. "It's Anna Carlson. Robert sent me the location." Edward breathed a sigh of relief as a woman in her early 40s, with dark hair tied back in a ponytail and carrying a backpack full of equipment, entered the hideout. Anna Carlson looked around, quickly taking in the situation. Her eyes settled on Elena, and Edward saw something shift in her expression. Professional hardness gave way to genuine outrage. "You're Elena?" she asked gently, kneeling to the girl's level. Elena nodded, instinctively moving closer to Isabel. "I hear you've been very brave," Anna continued, "and that you have an important story to tell." For the next hour, Anna conducted careful interviews with each of them. Isabel recounted how she had discovered the pattern of disappearances and her subsequent forced commitment. Robert presented documentary evidence of the network's financial and operational connections. Edward described his first meeting with Elena and how he had uncovered the truth of her situation. But it was Elena's testimony that impacted Anna the most. With terrifying maturity, Elena described life on the farm, the impossible hours, the heavy labor, the cruel punishments, the psychological isolation. She spoke of children who got sick and received no proper medical care, of supervisors who used violence to maintain discipline, of the constant propaganda that they were lucky to have a place to stay. "And you never doubted your mother would come back?" Anna asked. "Sometimes," Elena admitted. "On the hardest nights, I almost believed she was really dead. But then I'd remember what she always told me, that a mother's love is stronger than any lie." Anna stopped the recording and was silent for a moment. "This story is going to shake the country," she said finally. But you understand that by exposing this, you'll become even bigger targets. We're already targets, Edward answered. The difference is that now we can fight back. There's something else, Robert said, his expression turning grim. During our escape today, I intercepted communications suggesting they're planning to move the children from the farm to other locations. If we don't act quickly, the physical evidence will disappear. Anna checked her watch. My story goes live on the 6 a.m. broadcast. That gives us about 5 hours to make sure you're safe when the story breaks. It was then they heard sirens in the distance, growing progressively louder. Elena ran to the window. That's a lot of police cars, and they're coming this way. Edward realized the moment of truth had arrived sooner than they'd expected. They would have to choose between hiding and continuing to run, or confronting their pursuers head-on and risking everything in one last gamble to expose the truth. Anna, he said, how long do you need to get this story out? If I leave now and go straight to the station, I can have it on the air in 2 hours. Edward looked at Elena and Isabel, then at Robert. They all understood that the decision they made in the next few seconds would determine not only their fate, but that of dozens of other children trapped in the same cruel system. Go, Edward said. We'll buy you time. Anna disappeared via the escape route Elena had shown her, carrying the recordings that could change everything. Edward watched from the window as police cruisers surrounded the building. They weren't just police cars. There were also dark, unmarked sedans he recognized as the type used by Mr. King's team. They brought a lot of backup, Robert muttered, counting the cars. They're taking this seriously. Elena was surprisingly calm, as if her entire life on the streets had prepared her for moments like this. There are 3 ways out of this building, she said, but they probably know them all by now. Isabel clutched her daughter's hand. I won't let them separate us again. They won't, Edward promised, though he didn't know how he could keep that promise. A megaphone crackled from outside. Edward Sterling, Robert Shaw, Isabel Morales, you are surrounded. Come out with your hands up and no one will get hurt. Edward recognized Mr. King's voice. The man had come personally to ensure they were captured. We have a child in here, Edward yelled back. Whatever you do, remember there's an innocent child. The child is being held against her will by kidnappers. The response came immediately. We are here to rescue her. Elena grimaced in disgust. They're very good at turning lies into truth, she said, with a bitterness that shouldn't exist in a 6-year-old. Robert was monitoring radio frequencies on his equipment. Anna made it to the station, he reported. She's on the air in 45 minutes. 45 minutes, Edward repeated. We have to hold out for 45 minutes. It was then they heard footsteps on the stairs. King's men had decided not to wait any longer. Edward made a decision that surprised everyone. Robert, take Elena and Isabel to that special hiding spot she mentioned, the space between the walls on the 4th floor. I'm going down to talk to them. Edward, that's suicide, Robert protested. It's not. It's a distraction. As long as they're focused on me, you'll be safe. Elena ran to Edward and hugged him tightly. Mr. Edward, you promised you would never leave me. Edward knelt and looked into the girl's eyes. And I'm not leaving you. I'm protecting you the only way I can. In less than an hour, everyone will know the truth about what they did to you and your mother. Isabel approached. Edward, how can I ever repay you for what you've done for us? By taking care of Elena and helping other children when this is all over, he replied. Edward went down 2 flights of stairs and shouted, I'm coming down, alone. When he reached the ground floor, he was met by a dozen armed men. Mr. King stood in the center of the group, his immaculate suit contrasting with the filth of the abandoned building. Mr. Sterling, Mr. King said with a cold smile, you've caused a great deal of unnecessary trouble. Unnecessary. A child was being exploited. A mother was forcibly committed to silence her. Nothing I did was unnecessary. You don't understand the complexities of the situation. These children need structure, discipline. What we offer is far better than life on the streets. Forced labor and punitive isolation aren't structure. They're abuse. Mr. King sighed theatrically. Where are the others, Edward? Make this easier on all of us. I don't know. They ran when they saw you coming. A lie. This building is surrounded. No one got out. Edward maintained a neutral expression, though his heart was racing. Every minute he could prolong this conversation was another minute for Anna Carlson to prepare the broadcast. Mr. King, Edward said, can I ask you a question? How do you sleep at night, knowing you're exploiting children? I sleep very well, King answered coldly, knowing that I am removing problematic elements from society and giving them purpose and discipline. Problematic elements. They're children. They're children who, if left to their own devices, will grow up to be criminals, addicts, prostitutes. We are saving them from that fate. Edward realized with horror that Mr. King actually believed what he was saying. In his twisted mind, he was a savior, not an exploiter. It was at that moment that one of King's men's phones rang. After a quick conversation, the man whispered something in his ear. King's expression changed dramatically. What journalist? What evidence? Edward smiled for the first time in hours. Anna had made it. It seems the truth is coming out, Edward said calmly. Mr. King glared at him with hatred. You have no idea the forces you're dealing with. This doesn't end here. No, Edward agreed. It ends with you and your associates in prison. Before King could respond, radios began to crackle with urgent messages. The story had gone live. Within minutes, reporters would be descending on the scene. Edward saw panic grow in King's eyes. The man had spent years operating in the shadows, and now he was about to be exposed to the harsh light of the national media. Find the woman and the child, King ordered desperately. Now! But it was too late. Edward could hear sirens approaching, real sirens this time, not from King's cars. The FBI had been alerted by Anna's broadcast. Elena, Isabel, and Robert emerged from their hiding place when it became clear King's men were more concerned with escaping than searching for hostages. Is it over? Elena asked, running to hug Edward. It's over, he confirmed, embracing the girl and realizing that for the first time in weeks, he could breathe freely. The truth had won, but Edward knew a new phase was just beginning, rebuilding the lives that had been shattered and ensuring this kind of abuse never happened again. 5 weeks had passed since that cold winter morning when Elena first walked into Edward's boutique. Now, on a sunny spring afternoon, she was standing in the same spot, but everything had changed completely. Where the luxury shoe store once stood, the Elena Morales Community Center now rose, a welcoming space dedicated to vulnerable children. The walls, once decorated with expensive shoes, now displayed colorful drawings made by the dozens of children who frequented the center daily. Edward watched Elena play in the small park they had built where the stockroom used to be. She wore a new dress, comfortable shoes, and most importantly, she smiled with the genuine carefree joy of a 6-year-old. Isabel was sitting on a nearby bench, reading a book while watching her daughter, her eyes occasionally filling with tears of gratitude. I still can't believe we pulled it off, said Robert, approaching Edward. The former private investigator now ran the security for the center, ensuring all the children served were truly protected. Sometimes neither can I, Edward admitted, watching Elena teach a younger child how to tie their shoes. But look at her. Look how she's blossomed. The expose by Anna Carlson had caused a national scandal. Mr. King and his associates were arrested. The farm was shut down and investigated, and dozens of children were reunited with their families or placed in genuinely safe homes. Al Miller, the cruel baker, had been arrested for child abuse, and the entire urban renewal network was dismantled. Isabel approached them, carrying a folder of drawings. "The children made these for you," she said, handing the folder to Edward. Edward opened it and found dozens of colorful drawings, some showing him and Elena in the boutique, others depicting the community center. but all of them overflowing with gratitude and hope. A tear ran down his face as he read the messages written in childish script. "Thank you, Mr. Edward. You saved my life. Now I have a home. These are all children who were helped because you had the courage to fight for Elena," Isabel explained. "When one injustice is exposed, it shines a light on many others." Elena ran up to them, her hair flying in the wind. "Mr. Edward, Carla wants to show you the shoe she shined." Edward smiled. The center's vocational training program ironically included shoe care classes. Elena had become a natural instructor, teaching other children with the same dedication she herself had shown. "And how are you feeling about the change?" Isabel asked Edward as they walked toward the workshop. Edward looked around the space that once symbolized exclusion and now represented inclusion. "At first I thought I was losing everything. The store, the status, the life I had built. But in reality, I was gaining something far more valuable." "What?" "Purpose, family, the certainty that my life matters for something beyond profit." They entered the workshop, where an 8-year-old girl named Carla was proudly showing off a shoe she had polished to a mirror shine. It was the same technique Elena had perfected, now being passed on. "Perfect, Carla," Edward praised. "Elena taught you well." Elena beamed with motherly pride. "She's a fast learner, and she never complains about the work." Edward noticed how Eleanor had matured, not in the traumatic way life on the streets had forced upon her, but in a healthy way, developing empathy and natural leadership. Anna Carlson appeared at the workshop door. The journalist had become a frequent visitor, documenting the center's progress for a series on social reform. "Edward, I have news," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "The bill inspired by Elena's story has passed in Congress. Starting next month, there will be mandatory federal protocols for investigating any report of child exploitation, and no child can be removed from their family without multiple independent evaluations." Edward felt a wave of profound satisfaction. Elena's story had not only saved her and her mother, it had created protections for thousands of other children. "And there's more," Anna continued. 3 other cities want to replicate the community center model. They want you and Isabel to help with the implementation." Isabel and Edward exchanged glances. The idea of expanding the project was tempting, but also daunting. "What do you think?" Edward asked Elena, knowing her opinion was crucial. Elena considered the question seriously, as she always did. "I think if we can help more children not go through what I went through, we should do it." Edward knelt beside Elena, as he had done so many times in the past weeks. "You know this would mean a lot of work, a lot of travel." "I know, but hard work is worth it when it's to help other people. You taught me that." Edward hugged Elena, realizing how she had become his greatest teacher, a child who had lost everything but never her compassion, who had been exploited but chose to use her experience to protect others. The sun was setting through the center's windows, painting everything in a golden light. Children played safely, families were reunited, and hope flourished where there had once only been despair. Edward looked at Elena, the brave girl who had walked into his store barefoot and changed his life forever, and knew this was only the beginning of a much greater journey. Sometimes, the simplest encounters truly can change entire destinies. And sometimes, a small child can teach an adult the true meaning of wealth. It's not in what we possess, but in what we are willing to give to protect those who need it most.